public-private investment models for scalable growth. Moderated by Ramya Faraj, senior presenter and producer, Forbes Middle East. Our panelists are Professor Norman Sadeh, Professor Computer Science, Software and Social Systems Department, Carnegie Mellon University. Her Excellency Dr. Margarete Schramböck, Board Member, Aramco Digital.
Hello again. Hello again, and welcome to the final panel of what has been another impactful global cybersecurity forum. And we are going to discuss today an issue that many CEOs are warning about. Cybercrime could threaten prosperity within the next few years, and the need for stronger investment has never been greater. This panel will explore how collaboration can reduce risk, can unlock capital, and drive scalable cyber innovation. I want to thank you very much for joining us today. And you're both from different regions. You have represented different regions and worked in many different regions. How are they reducing risk? How are they unlocking capital? And how are they driving innovation? Your Excellency.
Very, very happy to be here. As you might know, I'm born in Europe, and I've spent a lot of my time, my life in Europe, but I'm now living in Saudi, almost 2 years, so time is flying by, and I'm very much enjoying my life here in Saudi Arabia, so thank you for that, shukran. Looking at the developments worldwide on the cybersecurity, of course, we can only say that it's in the core and in the focus, and should be in the focus of everybody. So decision makers, especially in the public and private sector, have to align and to move forward together. It's not the one or the other, it's always building up this ecosystem. And if a country and a region like the GCC or Europe are working hard to build up this ecosystem, it's to fight the threats which are out there. And these threats are increasing day by day. They're not getting less, they're getting more and more. It's getting more and more dangerous. Just think about the inclusion of AI and the topic of the quantum computing in the space of cyber. So we have a lot to do. This can only be done by lining up. Europe has chosen a way to set a lot of standards and rules and regulations. Sometimes they overdo it, because this is hindering investments by the private sector and is shying people away. The Middle East, and I especially experience Saudi Arabia in a way that there is a lot of initiative. It's a young nation with average age 26. So they are prepared, and in Saudi Arabia we are prepared to do more testing and quick decision making and moving ahead quickly. So a combination of both is what we need.
And what's your experience in the States, Doctor? Is too much regulation hampering investment?
Okay, that's a very good question. So clearly the approaches in the US and in Europe are different, and perhaps for background, I'm actually a dual citizen. I was born and grew up in Belgium and had been living most of my adult life in the US, except for a few years when I actually worked for the European Commission. So my background is one that has included working for government, including funding people. It has also included working in public policy while I was at the European Commission. I'm also a professor, obviously, as you mentioned when I was introduced here, and I'm also an entrepreneur and an investor. And so I probably bring in an interesting perspective, hopefully, we'll find out, in terms of looking at what is going on in this sector from different perspectives. You mentioned regulation. Clearly, Europe has taken a more systematic approach when it comes to regulation. It's not the case that regulations do not exist in the US, despite what you might be hearing in the news. But certainly, for instance, when it comes to areas like AI, we've certainly seen fairly different approaches, with Europe trying to move fast and anticipate requirements in terms of making sure that these technologies are not going to harm their citizens. In the US, we've seen probably more emphasis, especially under the current administration, on making sure that innovation is not hampered, and perhaps taking the view that let's see what happens, and if something really goes bad, then perhaps then we can figure exactly what to do in regulations. So slightly different approaches, which also reflect a different mix of companies. As you know, there are more tech companies, and tech is a bigger part of industry and part of economic growth in the US than it is perhaps in Europe, and that might also very well influence things. But I'm not going to continue. I'll let you ask more questions, and hopefully we'll cover some of these other topics as we move forward.
We certainly will. And Your Excellency, share with us your thoughts on how cybersecurity investment can really be embedded into broader national economic development and digital transformation strategies.
So what I have experienced, because I was Minister for Digital Affairs and then responsible for this and for economy, what we did is we combined these two topics, and it shows already that it is inherent to each of the jobs we have. So irrespective of where you are working, if you have a department role, if you're an employee, if you are a minister, each of them, so cybersecurity topics should be in each of these areas. And so you have chosen well to be here because it's the hot topic of the time, and it cannot be done without. Why? Because the human is always the start of everything. Even if we are now entering an age where or decades and century where AI plays a very important role, it always, in my view, boils down to the human. And the human as an employee is sometimes the biggest security risk. So you can invest millions if the password is 12345 or your birthday. We can invest as much as we want on all the different levels. It doesn't help. So training is an important topic. So an investment should always go together with the trainings, the necessary the necessary steps, or taking the steps to empower the next generation and existing and also elder generations to take the right moves. Yeah? If you get the call, I was here in Saudi, suddenly I got a call from somebody saying, I'm from the Ministry of Interior, it's about your APSHA and it's running out, and if you want to keep it, you need to give me your PIN. Of course I didn't, but there is, we know this, and there is a lot of these risks in the daily life, in the private life and in the business life. Yeah?
And so those risks often filter through the weakest link, don't they?
Yes, yes, that's correct. And this is where we need to invest. Saudi Arabia is doing that. I've just recently visited to Wake Academy, which is doing a lot, and in the schools, and the curriculum is changing. So this country is anyway in a big transformation. And with this young population, there is a big chance to do it. In Europe, I feel a little bit different. It is like the biggest challenge there is that we have a huge group, the majority of elder people. So our age pyramid is completely different to the Saudi one, where the Saudi one is like this, with a lot of young people. We have a completely different issue and problem in Europe, where we have elder people who are either excluded from the internet because they cannot do it anymore, or when they do it, like my mother, she is 83, yeah, now, and at the age of 80, she started to use WhatsApp. I was very proud of her, but of course I had to train her daily what risk is combined with that. Yeah? So different regions have different challenges, and investment always go together with education.
And going back to education and to universities, what considerations do universities and do businesses really need to weigh when they're deciding whether to enter into an investment partnership with a government or not?
Okay, it's a very good question, and I'd like to obviously fully agree on the importance of training. Security is not something that you can just delegate to professionals. Security is a task for everyone. This month is actually Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and it's about making sure that everyone contributes and does their very best. As a parenthesis, one of the things that I'm known for is actually for having founded a company that effectively created the segment in the cybersecurity sector that focuses on the human element. So we built a company that showed that it was actually possible to train people. For a long time, people said, don't even waste your time going there, you're not gonna manage. They would compare training people to throwing jello on a wall. It never sticks. If you know the analogy, at least in the US, that's something that makes sense to people.
We created the technology in the first place, lest they forget.
Yes, yes. And so I think training is extremely important, and there are obviously ways of training people that work better than others, but we also have to realize that there are limits to how much we can accomplish with training. And that has to do with the fact that security is known to be a secondary task. That means that we all make security decisions all the time. We were talking and you received that email. Your primary task was not to wait for that email. Your primary task, I would like to think, was speaking with me at that time. And then you made the security decision, the right one, which was to delete that email rather than clicking on that link. And that's very typical of what we do all the time. We make all these security decisions, but our focus is elsewhere. And our brains, unfortunately, are not wired to really focus on these secondary tasks. We tend to focus on the primary task, which often leads us to making the wrong decision. And so what I've seen through the company I started, which is a company that's being used to protect tens and tens of millions of people today, generating billions of dollars in value, what I have seen is that you can certainly accomplish something. You can definitely make a difference by training people, but there will be a limit to how much you can also accomplish. And eventually, and that's what I'm arguing these days, is you probably also need actually AI. You need to probably have security agents that are going to be watching over your shoulder and help you before it's too late, help you before you click on that link. Now, going to your question, I'm sorry if I did not.
I was going to ask you the question again.
No. So
Shall I repeat?
So it's about partnerships between
yes,
universities.
I mean, what are the
industry.
criteria that encourage you to enter into partnerships with government?
Well, universities have strong incentives to obviously work with governments. Most of them rely on government funding to sponsor research. Industry relies on academia also for innovation. Obviously, you want to find good ways of bringing these interests together in a meaningful manner. And so it has to do with making sure that research is ideally aligned with the needs of industry, except that sometimes industry doesn't even know its own needs. And so you need to find ways of funding research in academia in such a way that, on the one hand, you direct researchers to look at strategic issues, and at the same time, you ideally give them also some flexibility so that they can look at things that perhaps you didn't necessarily anticipate, and that might make a huge difference. And happy to talk about examples of that later on. But
sure, I mean, if you would like to share an example from your own experience, that would be wonderful.
Well, one example, since we were talking about the company I started back in 2008 now, this is an example where the technologies that we commercialized were initially developed in a project funded by the government, by the National Science Foundation. And we basically told the government that we thought we could take a very different approach to combating those phishing attacks that we were just talking about earlier. And our idea seemed a little crazy at the time to people. We said the best way to actually train people is, number one, to motivate them and show them that they're vulnerable to these attacks. And the best way to do that is to send them fake phishing emails directly in their inbox. If they fall for those emails, then you've shown them that they don't know everything they need to know, and they will be motivated to pay attention, and perhaps they will learn better at that point. And so we developed that. If you had been relying purely on strategic guidance from the government, nobody would have said that's the solution we need. So the government was flexible enough to say, hey, perhaps we should give these crazy people a chance and see what they come up with. Today, this is the de facto standard for training people. If you look, for instance, at NIST and the requirements they have when it comes to training people at companies, they tell you that these simulated attacks are actually the way to go. And so you need to have a strategic vision, and that has to come from industry and government, but you also need to leave academia some freedom to come up with those crazy ideas. Many of them will fail, but once in a while, some of them will succeed.
Collaboration and don't say no to crazy ideas.
Not too quickly. Give people a chance.
Those could be the unicorns.
If it looks really crazy, then stop the funding then.
Okay. Your Excellency, from your perspective as both a policymaker and an industry leader, what incentives do you feel are really most effective for stimulating cross-sector cyber R&D?
Yeah, in my view, it's all about de-risking the investment on both sides and bringing those two sectors together. Because if they do the things separately, it's okay, but it's not the optimum. So we need to find ways they collaborate, especially the private sector needs to find a safe haven. And the public sector has, and this is done really excellent in Saudi Arabia, has the clear role to go ahead, to be the early adopter, to be the pilot, to allow the companies to work with them to raise a pilot. This is not true everywhere in the world, where the public sector sometimes is underfunded or has no time. People are re-elected all the time, so I've experienced this myself when average elections in some European democracies would take 2 years, and you don't have enough time to really implement a prototype or something like this. This is different here. And I enjoy this a lot because there is a vision, there is KPIs derived from the vision, and there's clear cybersecurity KPIs, what is going to be done, the ecosystem to build up, and then to put all the people together, and at the same time give the freedom to develop innovation. So now it's a time also, of course, to attract talent from outside. Just seen the figures on the most innovative countries in the world, so to catch up to those, this bridge between private and private and public sector needs to work. So it's about co-investment, so half investment public, half private, co-funding, but also like what I like a lot is regulatory sandboxes. There is a few coming up in Saudi Arabia, one in the e-mobility space around KAUST, you might know this. And all these sandboxes need to consider also, of course, the cybersecurity aspect. So if you put this aspect into all of the sandboxes, then you have a playing ground where you can test this and take in always the cybersecurity topic.
There is indeed a strong vision, and contrary to many other countries, you have both the private and the public sector aligned in executing that vision. Yes. And just going back to de-risking, what are the most effective and impactful ways to de-risk?
Well, it's common investment. I think if the public sector also takes the risk to put money inside, and the private sector, there are different instruments. I had such in Austria. There are others here where there is really a co-investment. So especially in R&D, this is very effective. So to co-invest. So have 14% cash refund. That's a typical example of Austria, which was implemented in Austria. So you get cash back of 14% of any R&D you spend. And then you can put focus areas like the cybersecurity. I like also a lot the smaller incentives which governments give. So in this case, small is beautiful. It's not always the big budgets, because sometimes with the big budget, the SME, private sector, thinks, oh, this is nothing for me. It's something for the Aramcos and the Mardens and the other guys. But we need the private SME sector because they are employing a lot of people and they are a source of innovation and R&D if we only allow them to participate.
I'd like to maybe reinforce that message, if I may, and talking in particular about de-risking, it's important to understand that we live in a highly interconnected economy. And so if you look at the larger companies, for instance, Aramco here, they have amazingly sophisticated people working for them in cybersecurity. But then you look a bit more closely and you realize that they rely on a very complex network of suppliers. And some of these suppliers are a lot smaller, a lot less sophisticated. At the end of the day, cybersecurity requires that everyone, right, any one of those entities can potentially be an entry point, and we've seen this over and over again, can be an entry point for an attack. And so just looking at your own company and looking at what takes place within the four walls of your company is no longer sufficient. You need to make sure that everyone within your economy meets a basic set of requirements. Yes. And so the government has a very important role to play, not just in terms of regulations, but also in terms of these sandboxes, so that the smaller companies, the medium-sized companies that are less sophisticated, that have fewer resources, are put in a position where they can actually meet these more stringent requirements. That at the end will help everyone. It will help those companies themselves, but it will also help the larger companies that rely on them as suppliers. Another point I wanted to make, if I still have another minute, is obviously we're looking at different regions around the world here, and we're talking about what is the role of the government, what is the role of industry. In each region, the US, Europe, Saudi Arabia, has a different ecosystem and is at a different stage in terms of where its industry is, what the gaps are, where its universities are. I think the role of government in general, and I believe we'll probably agree on that, is to fill in the gaps, right? So government in Europe will fill certain gaps that perhaps do not exist in the US. The government in Saudi Arabia will probably fill in gaps that perhaps do not exist in Europe or in the US. And as these gaps get filled, the government obviously has to revisit how it prioritizes its budget and what new gaps it has to fill. And so the answers are not one size fits all. It really depends on where your ecosystem is and where the needs are.
And just going back to our conversation on de-risking, tell us how academia can really contribute to de-risking innovation and accelerating commercialization of cybersecurity research. And if you could share with us an example, that would be great.
Well, so de-risking research is an interesting concept because research is about taking risk in many ways, right? And this is why we've got venture capital also when it comes to starting companies. It's about looking for people who are willing to take risk, and obviously it's about creating incentives for these people so that they've got a decent chance of getting a return on their investments. But the story for research and de-risking research is fail fast, right? So if you've got ideas, right, do not necessarily fund, if those ideas look a little crazy, they might be very promising, give them a chance and see what happens, but do that in a very incremental manner. Start small. Europe has actually many programs where you provide a little bit of seed money, you see what happens. VCs work the same way. They provide you with some seed money. If things go well, perhaps at some point you start selling your technology. You might be able to raise a Series A, perhaps a Series B later. And so I think everyone has learned and is still learning today to obviously try to reduce risk. Cybersecurity is a huge, huge problem. It's only going to get worse over time, unfortunately. And so even though there are massive amounts of money being made available in this space, you look at the amount of venture capital available, for instance, in the US in cybersecurity, it ranges between $10 and $20 billion a year. It's quite significant. You look at the overall size of the cybersecurity market, it's hundreds of billions of dollars today, so that may seem like a lot, but in truth, it's an arms race, and the resources we'll have to deploy to continue to protect our economy and our people will unfortunately continue to grow as far as I can tell. And so we need to de-risk indeed, right, so that we can continuously be as wise as possible in the way in which we deploy these resources to address those risks and those needs.
And we heard earlier today that Saudi's cybersecurity market is now at 15 billion rial, which is remarkable. And when it comes to driving scalable growth in cybersecurity, just to expand on what you were saying, how can both European and Middle Eastern public-private frameworks complement each other in driving this growth?
Yeah, maybe I want to give, before I answer the question, another example of a tool which is used here and also in Europe, which is very effective, is the innovation hubs. So to create innovation hubs, which include the academia, the universities, the SME, and the larger companies, and then we created such a cybersecurity innovation hub. And we said, okay, the larger company can only take the money if they include 3 to 4 smaller companies, as you said before. So these innovation hubs, and then these innovation hubs can connect throughout Saudi Arabia, the GCC, and the European Union, as we had it there. And when then you create a web of innovation hubs, They can specialize in certain areas and they can share the innovation, and they are close, which I like a lot, is close to the regions. We sometimes have a tendency to centralize, also in governments. We want things to be centralized, forgetting that people are living in the regions. Yeah? They are living out there. They should stay. They should not all come to a certain city in Austria. It's Vienna, for example, and all study there and all stay there. But therefore, we need to create innovative hubs, and these cybersecurity hubs have turned out to be really successful. Yeah? And so regions can learn from each other, as you said. Filling the gaps is an important topic, and then looking what best practices we can find. And I always say copy with pride. Yeah? I always looked around who had the best idea and then copy, because time is key in this sector. We have to be fast, because there is a huge economy out there which is working all against the public sector, the private, the safety, your kids, the next generations who want to do them harm. And so we need to be fast and effective.
Professor Sadeh.
So I agree with everything that was said here. I would potentially point out another dimension that we've not touched on, but I think it's very relevant to GCF. GCF being a global organization, obviously, cybersecurity is a global problem, and it's not something that you're going to try to solve country by country. There is a deep need for the development of standards in the context of cybersecurity. We've seen many standards developed over the years. There are various organizations that develop these standards. IETF is a good example of them. The UN has played a key role in helping standardize, for instance, certificates, to go back to the basics. And moving forward, I expect that there will be many more needs for the development of standards as the problems that we're facing in security continue to become increasingly complex. In security, we like to talk about attack surfaces, which has to do with all the different ways in which systems can come under attack. As our technologies become more complex, as new layers of technologies get added on top of new layers of technology, you need to develop new standards that are going to enable companies to better protect themselves, and to do this across these supply chains. So it's not just about protecting what takes place within the four walls of your company, but also doing so with all the other partners with which you interact. And I think the GCF has potentially a role to play in identifying the needs for new standards. I'm not suggesting it should become a standardization body itself. There are standardization bodies out there. The UN itself can obviously play a role as well, but this is certainly a place where, as people come together and discuss new challenges, as they talk about AI and they talk about post-quantum computing, cybersecurity, they will find needs for new standards within those areas, and this is potentially a great forum where to identify these needs and to start getting organized to make progress on those fronts.
Give us some ideas on financial or regulatory incentives. You mentioned a couple, but surely there are more. I mean, that would best encourage deeper collaboration between universities, governments, private capital.
Well, it's co-funding. That's for me, that's the best incentive. So to look at the country, the respective country, and then to see what can be co-funded in this way by the public and the private sector. Then it is these grants, of course. This is always an incentive, helping, and also having an environment which is not so much the case in Europe. They are lacking the capital, which the US has, to go the next step. So we have not managed, our capital market is not strong enough and is not developed enough. So a good developed capital market is also key for that. And then beside other startups, there will be a lot of startups around the cyber because there is a lot of need.
Mm-hmm.
So in the US, we're lucky enough to have about 1,500 or 1,600 VC-backed cybersecurity companies, which is an amazing number. Not that all of them will be successful. I come from Carnegie Mellon, which is based in Pittsburgh, and it's an interesting city because most people still associate Pittsburgh with basically the steel industry. And there's still a little bit of that. But if you look today at the economy in Pittsburgh, it's an economy that's driven by innovation coming out of Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh. Those are basically the engines of growth here, with many, many startups that have been started, an increasingly large number also of VC money flowing to the companies that are being started. That was not the case a few years ago. It takes a long time to build an ecosystem, and Pittsburgh certainly does not claim to be anywhere near Silicon Valley today. But as you find government working with industry and working with universities, if they work well together, they can create an environment that will promote the creation of these types of ecosystems, and that will facilitate the emergence of new companies. And we need many more companies in cybersecurity. My own company was acquired by a larger NASDAQ-listed company, and that's how these companies basically continue to survive. Today, the products that my company builds are basically at the core of the company is called Proofpoint. It was public when they acquired us. Proofpoint was acquired for $12 billion in 2021, and technology I developed with my colleagues are basically representing the majority of the sales, and I think are used by 75% of the Fortune 100 companies. So this is an example of how basically the right ecosystem, obviously with some luck in our case, and I don't mean to suggest that this was all preordained, but those are the kinds of ecosystems that you want to create, and we need many more of these types of companies if we are to keep our economy secure.
Congratulations on that fantastic exit. And we're talking about big tech in the States. What role does big tech and global investors play in shaping sustainable cyber investment ecosystems?
Yeah, you can, please.
So the large tech companies are very sophisticated. They hire actually many of our graduates from Carnegie Mellon. So they have some of the top talents in cybersecurity. And the role that they can play is they can help, again, all the different other actors with which they interact. I like to give examples, for instance, related to mobile apps. Right? So mobile app is a new development that we've seen over the past 15 plus years, and it has basically enabled anyone, including people who had never programmed before, to start developing apps that people then download on their mobile phones. The vast majority of these apps are completely terrible. Even if they don't necessarily crash, many of them have security flaws. One of the things that I've advocated for many years and that we've seen being adopted over the past few years now by the app stores, both Apple and Google, for instance, in the US, is increasingly stringent requirements before these apps get published, increasingly stringent processes that have got to go through. And so that's an example of what these big tech companies can do. They're the most sophisticated entities. They've got more resources, and they should really help the smaller entities with which they partner to basically raise the bar for everyone. At the end of the day, Apple will not be a company that continues to be trusted if the apps that people download from the App Store are apps that have flaws. And so they've come to realize that, and that's an example of how they contribute to that. The other part, obviously, is to acquire more companies. These companies are basically creating a market for startups. So when you go and raise money, you can still hope to go public, and that's becoming a bit more popular these days. But for the past few years, the more common exit was to actually be acquired by these big tech companies. So they've effectively created a market for people to say, hey, investors, you're not going to waste your money investing in my company because there's a potential exit. It may not be going public. It might just be being acquired by one of these larger companies.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Your Excellency, would you like to comment?
Yes, just one comment on this, because I've been a CEO of tech companies 15 years before I joined the government. And what I have seen that we had these waves. We had the strong tech companies like 20 years ago were infrastructure companies. They are nowhere nowadays because they didn't manage to innovate and to fail successfully. Because you need to fail successfully, you need to try something and then throw it away and do the next thing. So they either disappeared from the market, they got replaced by a lot of competition from China coming in, and they have lost ground compared to the new tech companies that we have now since the 80s, since the 90s, actually, not the 80s, was too early. But now these have again the challenge, because they are big, they have a lot of people to reinvent themselves continuously and to have open borders and to let the know-how of the startups flow in and flow out and to generate spin-offs. I think there is not enough spin-offs from the large tech companies in certain areas. And if this is not happening anymore, they will lose the innovation power because they live from the ecosystem they create around. Sometimes I've worked in these big tech companies. It's very difficult to innovate there because it's about targets, it's about the quarterly result, the monthly, maybe the weekly results. We had weird things like weekly reports, and then you cannot. How can you be creative and innovative? So you need the young guys around you to do that.
Well, quarterly results may have a limited time span if new legislation goes through. We'll see how that comes to be. As you know, President Trump is suggesting that we stop producing quarterly results. In any case, we have almost run out of time. One last question. Looking ahead to the next decade, one structural change in public-private investment framework that would most accelerate innovation while ensuring long-term sustainability and trust? Professor Sadeh.
Okay. Well, we will need much more money, I believe, in cybersecurity. Things are only going to get worse. And since I only have 1 second left, I'm going to pass the baton.
Your Excellency.
Very difficult to boil it all down to one thing, but as often has been said, but I think it is worth saying it again, the human, you as you are sitting here as human should stay in the center of attention, and the rest should be built around it. And we need to be careful and track this, especially for our next generation, because we want also your kids to have a good a good life and a very safe life.
Okay, ultimately, securing the digital future depends not just on funding, but on collaboration. I think that's the key takeaway here. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us, and thank you.